Hello everyone, this is Alazir Chess, and I'm here to help you to realize your potential. Today we're going to be doing a double header. We're going to be covering two games. One that I myself, Jacob Pope, also known as Alazir Chess, played in a tournament a few nights ago against a young man named Kurian. My USCF is 2065. I've been playing a lot of tournaments recently in the attempt to reach the National Master, and my opponent is rated 1794, and that'll be the first game that we look at. And then we're going to look at a blitz game that I played on lichess.org against International Master Little Pumpkin 4 years ago on my old Lichess account, which is Razor Tees, with 0 and 2 3s instead of the O and the E's. And let's get into it. I played d4, he played d5, I played my trusty Jobava London system with knight c3, he played knight f6, bishop to f4, pawn c5, and I played pawn to e3. Now, it's also possible here to play a gambit line with e4, d takes, and pawn to d5, but I didn't want to get into anything too messy and tactical, especially against a younger player. Like, I don't know if they're booked up on any of these short variations, so I wanted to keep it simple. I played my pawn to e3, c takes d, e takes d, and now a6 to stop any knight b5 shenanigans. And here we have knight to f3, and here it's possible for black to play bishop to g4, and after h3, bishop takes knight, queen takes, knight c6, and castles queenside. But here my opponent played knight to c6, and I played h3 to now prevent bishop g4. He played bishop to f5 instead, and I played bishop to d3, challenging the bishop. Here he takes, and I take with the queen. Now here he plays e6, the next logical move to develop the dark squared bishop. I castle, he plays bishop to d6, and I play knight to e2. Here he castles, and I take on d6, and after queen takes, I play knight to g3. Now I'm preventing knight e4, and now if I didn't play knight to g3, had I played, say, c3 instead, he could have played knight e4, and then I'll have to play knight d2, and he can swap off the knights, and here black has an easy game. He has no weaknesses, and I've traded off too many of my attacking units. So after knight g3, here he could have played knight to b4, and I would have played queen to e2. My opponent told me after the game that here he was worried about queen to b3, but queen to b3 doesn't do anything as the knight is defended by the queen on d6, and that just gives him b5, and if I kick the knight back, he just goes back, and he can still play for b4, rook f to c8 or f to b8, knight a5, and knight c4 is a possibility as well, and black's position here is very comfortable. So here, after knight g3, he played rook a to c8. Now here, if he wanted to put a rook on c8, he should have used the f rook in view of c3, b5, rook fc1, b4, c takes b, knight takes, and queen b3 with an equal position. Here, white has a 2-on-1 majority on the queen side, but this is far from getting active and having white promote a pawn. White would also have this weakness on d4, and I myself am not a fan of having these isolated pawns where they can't really be protected. They have to be protected by pieces, and I can't get active and attack, and I just have to play the sort of slow waiting game and play very defensive while trying to get these two pawns up the board. Not my cup of tea, but I know that that's one of the ideas that white has in a position like this. Here, I play this position in a way that's probably dubious, but it does offer me attacking chances. I don't play for the queen side, but I play for a king side attack. So here after rook c8, now the threat of knight b4 is substantial because he'll be hitting the queen and the pawn on c2, stealing a pawn. So I play pawn c3, and he plays pawn to g6 here after almost 30 minutes thought. And this was a game 65 with a 5-second delay. And here he was at 32 minutes after playing pawn to g6. Here, after the game, he told me that he wasn't exactly sure what to do in this position, but we discussed the plan of attacking on the queen side for black. I hope that it helps him out. G6 here is not the greatest move, but it also doesn't lose or anything just because it's played. It still has a plan attached to it, and his position was still okay throughout the game until he made a serious mistake. But it was a very difficult position, so I wouldn't have found the right move either. Here, after rook a1, knight e7, queen to d2, threatening to infiltrate on the dark squares, and king g7 covering, and here I played knight to h4. Now the reason why I played knight to h4 was because I wanted to have two pieces to attack on f5 with. I also wanted to keep the knight on g3 to prevent any knight to e4 ideas, and here it also prevents knight to f5, because if he plays knight f5, we have knight takes, and if g takes, we have queen g5, king to the corner, queen takes with check, king g8, and now knight takes on f5, hitting the queen and threatening mate. This wins the queen. And in the event of pawn takes knight, queen g5, this puts pressure on the position. Here, black has to move back to the corner, because if you play, say, knight e4, hitting the queen and the knight, I can sacrifice the rook instead of playing knight takes. This knight takes just allows for f takes, and here black is good, but rook takes knight, giving up material, and after f takes, there's knight f5 check, which wins the queen due to the pin. So king back, knight takes queen, and white is just winning. Now, in the game though, that didn't happen. He played rook f to e8, and I played rook to e5. Now, rook e5 has several ideas in mind. Here he played knight to d7, which was the reply that I wanted to induce. And here I had knight to h5 as an idea, rook to h5 as an idea. None of these ideas work, unfortunately, because after takes, king h8, queen h6, rook g8, and all of the business squares are covered, unfortunately for me. But instead, I had two ideas up my sleeve as backup ideas, and one was to play f4, which I did in the game, and another was to play rook to e2. And rook to e2 sort of steals a tempo, because the knight went back to d7, and now I play the rook back to e2, and now if he goes back, then here I could double up, and I could attempt to bring my knight back and play for h4, h5, and have ideas of playing the knight to g5 then, and trying to line up sacrifices against e6, which I was thinking about doing. And according to the engine, rook to e2 is the best move in this position, but I played f4, which is dubious. The idea for black here is not to take the rook, which he did in the game, but to play queen c7, and now my queen can't get into the king side on the dark squares, And because I don't have access to the dark squares with my queen, like, I don't have the attack that I desired, and therefore f4 is a bad move on my part, and I should have went with rook to e2, and after rook e2, I would have had an equal game, but I would have had chances to attack on these weakened dark squares on the king side. And now to show you a game that I had against an international master named Little Pumpkin on lishs.org. And this game was played 4 years ago, but I used it as a template for this attack. And that game started with d4, d5, and instead of knight c3, there was bishop to f4 immediately. The regular London system, c5, e3, takes, knight c6, and here this is now a Caro-Kann exchange variation position. If I play pawn to c3, and then I can develop this knight to d2, but here I played knight c3, a6, we transpose back into the Jobava London, h3, bishop f5, knight f3, e6. Instead of having the knight on f6, the pawn goes to e6. Bishop to d3, takes, bishop to d6, bishop takes, queen takes, castles, and knight g7. Now, the knight placement here is not necessarily wrong, but it does have a defect of not covering the h7 square with the knight, as we'll see later. So knight e2, castles, c3 to prevent knight b4. Now b5, rook fe1, b4, knight g3, takes, rook fc8, rook e2, rook c7, rook ae1, knight g6, knight h5, and here my opponent could just ignore the knight on h5, but he chose to swap it, which was a mistake. And now g3, and here he could have played queen h6 to keep an eye on the g5 square, to gain a tempo on the pawn on h3 and induce king g2 for me, and then it would be his move again. But he chose to play queen to d6, which ran into knight g5, g6, h4, knight e7, h5, knight f5, h takes, and a rook sacrifice to break through. Rook takes e6, double exclam, f takes, rook takes, queen f8, and now rook takes on g6. Here knight g7 was played, and rook c6, the final shot, threatening the rook on c7 and threatening mate with queen to h7. So queen f5 was played, queen's trade to gain time. Now I capture the rook on c7 and it's game over. So this was a game I was thinking about when I came up with the rook from e1 to e5 idea, and then back to e2 to double in the game that I was just playing through against Kurian. So during the tournament, I was thinking about the game against Little Pumpkin, and I thought rook e2 would be good in the position that we got to, but here I don't really have the makings of an attack just yet. It's an equal game, but I would have that as a long-term plan, and it's what I should have gone for. But I went for the fences here with f4, he took, which is a mistake, and takes, and now queen d8, queen g5, and knight g8, the best move to cover the kingside dark squares, e7, f6, and h6 all at once. Knight h5 check because of the pin, king to h8, king f8 loses due to knight takes, h takes, and queen takes, which I was going to play in the game, but I didn't calculate the whole thing. I just thought this has to be better for me, like this is completely winning. but he does have a few different ideas he could try to defend. But I actually missed in my calculation a very beautiful shot with queen takes g6, ending the game immediately because of the threat of mate on g7. And if you take the queen, knight takes, which is in a very unusual mate, with the knight checking the king, the escape square is covered, the g7 square is covered by the other knight, and the rook on f1 is pinning the pawn on f7. This is very unusual, and this just didn't even cross my radar in my calculations. But he played king to h8, which is correct. Now knight f6, and knight takes knight, pawn takes, queen d6. Now, here, I thought he had to play rook to g8, and then queen h6 would run into queen f8 here, defending. So I was going to play for knight f3 and put the knight on e5 or g5, bring the queen back to h4. So let's say he plays queen to f8. Then I could play either knight e5 right away, or I could play for here rook to f4 as well. And if, say, queen f8 here, knight f3, h6, and rook h4 ideas. If king to h7, it turns out here that I have knight e5 to g4, which I didn't see in my calculations, but I figured if you have to play this defensively, something should crop up. But here, after queen to d6, I was thinking, okay, that's clever. You can bring the queen to f8 while keeping the rook centralized. And I thought that I could play knight f3 to e5 here, which I can. But then I found something that's immediate here. I was thinking, and I was about to move the knight, and then I'm like, wait, instead of knight f3, what about knight takes g6? And knight takes g6 runs into h takes, queen h6, king g8, and mate. Or if king g8, we have knight to e7 double check, king back to the corner and mate, king over, queen g7, queen to g7 mate, or queen g8 mate. And therefore, there's only one move here, f takes, and now f7, breaking through. Now, if the rook moves to d8, we have queen to f6 with checkmate. If the rook moves to f8, we have queen to f6 checkmate. There's rook to g8 here, and then here I could take the rook, but here he plays e5. Now, e5 allows the queen to cover the f6 square, so he just gives back the rook. And after takes, 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 here I thought for a while, and I was looking at queen f6 check, which is the best move. Because after takes, takes, rook e2, there's rook b6, rook e7, and now king f2, and my king is closer to the center. He has an isolated pawn. I have ideas of getting behind the pawn. I also have ideas of, say, getting behind the pawn if he were to, say, do nothing. Let's say a5, I can get behind the pawn. If he defends it, I have check, king up, check, and then picking off the b pawn. And this is a better endgame for me, but right now I'm in the middle of trying to work on my rook and pawn endings. I wanted to keep the queens on because we were both low on time, but he was much lower on time. So I wanted to keep the pressure. And here He played queen to b6 check. I played king to h2. He played rook to e8 because the rook is hanging and mate is threatened on the f8 square. After rook e8, I played the final sacrifice, rook e1, and this cannot be accepted because, again, queen to f8 will be checkmate. He played queen to d8. I swapped the rooks, threw in a check. King's forced to go over, threw in another check while taking the pawn. And here, queen f7 is not playable because I can swap queens and play king g3 with a winning king and pawn ending, 5-4. So here, after queen takes pawn check, he played king f8, and I took on b7. Here, he played check. I covered with the pawn, and then he checked again. I played queen g2, and here I saw that he had queen to d3 when I took the pawn on b7, and I trusted myself to find a way to win this because I'm 2 pawns up, but it would not be the easiest conversion in the world. But my plan was to play pawn to h4. Our silicone friend believes that I should play pawn to a4 here, which, like, I did not even consider this move, but I only had about 8 minutes left on the clock anyway. But here, my opponent played queen c4 with pressure on a2, so I played queen f3 check. He stepped the king over. Queen f3 covers c3 so that I can play b3 and everybody is safe. He brings the queen back to e6. I played queen to f2 to cover the e1 square. Now he has no infiltration points. And now I can just push the c pawn up the board. He played queen to e5 here, which is the final mistake. And I played queen to d4. He swapped out. I took king f6, king g2, king f5, king f3. And we played on until I checkmated him. But this is a completely winning king and pawn ending. I don't have the rest of the game recorded because when my opponent is under 5 minutes by USCF rules, I don't have to keep recording the game, so I didn't, but played on until mate. So I hope that you enjoyed these 2 games, and I'd also like to give a shout out to Simon Williams due to his Jobava London course, which I learned from many years ago. I got his courses, and then I put my own spin on these lines and on these openings. And also a shout out to Hans Niemann. I have his course as well. It's very good. I would highly recommend it, even over Simon Williams' course, which is also very good. Thank you guys for watching. And again, if you like an opening, keep playing it and keep studying it, keep improving, and keep evolving and becoming better day by day. So have a great night or a day whenever you're watching this. Thank you for the viewership, and bye-bye.